Movie games on consoles were usually considered a hot topic with regards to allowing movies to be able to be adapted to the video game format, which would also contribute to many controversial elements. Because if we look back over the history and long legacy of the video games industry, there are many games across a variety of different consoles dating all the way back to the early eras of systems, where many games were always based off of adaptation of popular movies that would allow you to play as your most favourite iconic characters from the big screen in a video game format. But in many cases the translation from movie to the games console was definitely a mixed bag, as while yes, we had some very good titles that would go on to be super successful, but there were a lot of questionable and low quality entries that left you wondering how is it even possible, making you even think that the game should never have been developed in the first place. And this still happens even today. Early Sega consoles such as the Sega Master System are definitely no stranger to this feat, as it also presented a vast array of titles based off of movie franchises that also had its fair share of decent titles, but many of them were definitely better left unsaid or avoided altogether, which we will cover in this video. We are going to take a look at some of the most popular entries while also going through the worst of entries that are available on the system, so that you can see for yourself the questionable aspects as to why these games even exist, but also to look at some of the positives with regards to the best points of some of these games, because not all of them are bad, let's just get that out of the way, but you're quickly going to see which ones are, starting with the first title on this list. So let us just quickly address the elephant in the room and what I consider to be the worst game of this kind on this list. As it's a shame really, because I consider the Back to the Future series to be among my favourite films ever. So with the popularity of such an iconic movie franchise, it's always inevitable to see some sort of adaptation of some kind to come to consoles. But bearing that in mind, this game is really just an atrocious mess, and I genuinely don't like to say it in that sense, but you can't help but see things for what they are. The game was released in 1989, not just on the Sega Master System, but on a variety of different consoles and home computers, and they were all met with the same type of response with regards to reception and reviews, stating the game to be just very mediocre and just an overall lackluster experience, which is a shame really. But this here game is living proof that movie adaptations to the gaming format, especially in earlier times, more often than not genuinely didn't work. And in this case it was quite rightly so with Back to the Future 2, because it tried to be a combination of so many different genre types, with the first couple of levels being seeing you hovering around the street on your hoverboard, where you have to collect items and pretty much avoid everything that gets in your way, from obstacles and people. Anything on the map literally can kill you, and it's just so frustrating. You will play this game a million times over before you ever get one good run at it. I witnessed that the first time I played it, and to be honest, when I look back, it was a joke how I allowed myself to sit down and played it for as long as I did, and I did eventually complete it, so that'll tell you how stubborn that I was back then, but I definitely would not do that now. The game does present mixed elements with each of the levels, rating from using your hoverboard to like a side-scrolling brawler and even a mini puzzle game in some cases. So the game really loses its core identity. It really doesn't know what it's supposed to be, which is a shame, but this is only the start of things to come, as the next game on this list isn't much better. Published by Flying Edge and released in 1993, the Addams family tried to replicate the iconic moments from the memorable movie that was released only a few years prior. But like many of the adaptations of this game, it didn't live up to its expectation, as the game was released across a variety of different systems, with Sega consoles, Nintendo consoles, even home computers. So the Sega Master System also got a port, but it was very lackluster in its approach. It was a side-scrolling platform game that had some nice visuals visuals. If anything, that was the game's highlight feature, but that's pretty much where it ends, because everything about the game is just weird and off-putting. It can be slow and sluggish to play, and literally everything in the environment, even platforms you jump onto, if you jump and you hit the side of a platform, or you jump and hit your head off a platform, it will damage you. Literally everything in this game that you touch can damage you pretty much straight away. So the collision detection is absolutely atrocious. So a lot more time and effort could have gone into the overall development of this game, but clearly, like with a lot of these titles, it was developed in a way as a cash grab, just to capitalise on the success of those movies, as they were very popular for their time. But not all of the games, especially on this list, managed to capture those elements. And this here, while it does have some decent features, it still isn't enough to stop it from falling into the realm of obscurity, and often considered as one of the worst games on the console itself due to those reasons. But don't worry, there's a lot more games like this that we will be covering on this list, which we will see in the next one. Home Alone, one of the most iconic movies ever in existence, would see a multitude of different ports of games being released on loads of different consoles to capitalise on the success of this very popular movie. But pretty much every single game across the board, regardless of which format it was released on, was considered a complete waste of time, as the gameplay just didn't match up to what was represented in the film, and each version of the game played very different from its counterparts. The Master System version being among some of the worst of these distinct games, even as much with the Sega Mega Drive being considered as equally as bad. That saw you running around various levels within different types of houses, and you had to evade the wet bandits by any means possible. What was the main controversy behind the game was its lack of playability and function. The game just felt very lackluster, very simplistic, but at the same time was just super difficult, to a point that the game just felt uninspiring, where you're just literally moving around the same type of levels over and over again, and you just have to just keep avoiding your enemies, and you have a very restricted time limit as well to gather up resources so that you can use them to your advantage. But literally everything in the levels can do damage or kill you in this, so it's very, very uninspiring, to say the least. If anything, it's definitely considered as one of the worst movie franchise games ever on the system, or in general, which is a shame. There would be sequels to this with Home Alone 2, but would be only released on later consoles with the Genesis or the Mega Drive, but wouldn't see a release on the Master System, and considering the efforts made with the development of this game, it's a good thing that that didn't happen. But with games like this coming out that were based off of iconic movies, it really didn't set a good standard for other well-known franchises. But that would not be the end of it, as we will now clearly see a lot more of that is yet to come. Disney's Ariel, The Little Mermaid, would release originally on the Sega Genesis and Game Gear consoles in 1992, but would be later ported to the Master System in Brazil in 1996. And this version of the game plays almost identical to that seen in the Game Gear version. While it does have some nice visuals, the gameplay aesthetics don't match up to the overall vibe and aesthetic the game's going for. The game is often considered as one of the worst movie adaptations or Disney games of all time, if not the worst ever seen, as it doesn't fully follow on the events of the movie. Now, the graphics in the game are definitely its best feature, but the gameplay can be sluggish, slow, clunky, and can even sometimes suffer from slowdown or frame rate issues depending on how long you spend playing the game. So there's definitely a lot of caveats and negative aspects to the experience. It won't be for everybody, let's just put it that way. It will only appeal to a select few players, but there are better games on this list that are definitely worth experiencing, and this really isn't one of them. Terminator 2 Judgement Day would release on multiple consoles and systems off the back of the success of quite simply one of the best movie sequels of all time. But again, like many other games, wouldn't reach the heights of success. While some of the versions were quite decent, the 8-bit entries definitely leave a lot of questions around it, as the gameplay can be lackluster and very frustrating. Even from the very first level, the game is overly difficult, where you have to progress to the end of the level by defeating all of the enemies in your way. But seeing as though you're the Terminator, you should be easily able to defeat enemies, but literally normal weaker opponents can do serious damage to you, and everyone can literally kill you with very little effort at all. And even if you compare this to the first game that was released in 1991, that was a very different experience, and in many ways the first Terminator game was 10 times better than this entry, which is weird when you think about it. You'd nearly expect it to be more of the same, but it's actually not. I remember even going back, being in school, and a friend of mine had Terminator 2 for the Commodore 64, and I remember a couple of times going back to his house after school and playing that version of the game. And I do remember specifically with some of the levels, especially with the second level, where you had access to the motorbike, where the T-1000 was chasing you in the lorry, and you had to get to an end point and avoid a load of obstacles along the way, and it was tough. But I remember even later on down the line, you played as Sarah Connor on one of the levels trying to escape from the hospital, so there was a lot of variety around it, and that was for me at the time a really good adaptation to the game. I really enjoyed it. But then when we go on to this version, and while I love the Sega Master System because it was the first console I ever played and owned, you would expect some level of quality around these games, especially if you played it on one system, but then when you played it on something else it was completely different. And this game was completely different to what I played on the Commodore 64, and it was nowhere near as good. It was very, very lackluster, very frustrating, and very, very difficult, because there's so many unbalances with regards to the combat physics, the collision detection, and even how the Terminator moves, that it just doesn't provide a good experience at all, which is a shame, because the first Terminator game on the Master System was quite decent. But unfortunately this is just another game that falls by the wayside with regards to movie inspired entries. Some of the ports of the game on different systems were not too bad, but this was definitely not one of them. Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade was released on a variety of different systems in 1990 and is a port of the memorable movie, but that's where it really ends as such, because regarding reviews of some of the ports of this game, the NES version was considered atrocious as it had bad collision detection, bad controls. So to make things worse, the game was then later ported to the Master System, which ended up being even worse. Literally from the first level, you have to grab your whip and then you have to fend off against enemies that have guns, which leaves you with virtually no chance to defeat them. And the collision detection is so bad that if you fall more than 10 feet off of any ledge, you die. If you hit an enemy and they're close to you, you'll die because the hit detection is non-existent, and it doesn't even allow you to flash to give you temporary invulnerability to attacks. It just will literally just wipe out your health bar, so you're gone straight away. The levels are overly difficult, it's hard to really know what to do, and the truth is you won't last long enough to really care, because every attempt that you have at this game, it will literally take you 100 attempts to even just get past the next section. It's just atrocious what we're seeing here, which really is a shame. The only good thing that's going for it in this version is the graphics are decent. If anything, it's the best part of the entirety of the game, which makes no sense as to why a lot of these movie franchises, that they could have been so much more. But the one thing that is apparent with the majority of these games is, yes, we had Acclaim that made a lot of them. Flying Edge was another one, but all of the games that were considered terrible were all developed by third-party developers, which clearly didn't care about the source material at all, which really is a shame, because these games could have been so much better. So like with many of the other games I've covered up to this point, this definitely is another one that I wouldn't really recommend that you should add. And considering, even if you were adding it to your collection, which I know a lot of people do, that'd be the only way that you would gain access to it. But even at that, the majority of these games nowadays are so ridiculously expensive that it may not even be worth your while at all. One of the things that you'll notice about many of the games in this list, especially the bad ones, is that the majority of them were published by Acclaim Entertainment, a company that was well known in the video game industry, that backed some very important titles and memorable entries, but at the same time were also notoriously responsible for many cash grabs and lackluster efforts. And it's clear to see why with many of the movie inspired ports of these games, not just on the Sega Master System but across across the board on multiple different consoles, being very lackluster and just poor overall. So it's easy to see why, when we look back at the history of the company, we now know why they met their untimely demise all those years ago, because many of the games were literally just cash grabs, just to try and capitalise on the success of well-known movies of the time. So another movie that would get the transition treatment would be Dragon, the Bruce Lee story. And while considered a good movie in its own right, which it was, the games didn't fare the same criticism. Probably the best entry in the entirety of the series would have been seen on the likes of the Atari Jaguar and the Sega Genesis, but even at that they had their own gripes with the games overall because they were considered very, very difficult. Graphically they were very good, but they were just overbearingly difficult. That made it a chore to get through. But then when we got later ports on the likes of lesser powered consoles with the Sega Master System and Game Gear, the gameplay would change up somewhat. That would move away from the fighting style mechanics of the more powerful systems, but would opt for a more side-scrolling beat-em-up approach with platforming elements. But especially with the 8-bit versions, there's no background music, and the graphics themselves, while they're decent considering that they were on the Sega Master System, they are very lackluster in their approach, and the overall gameplay is very lethargic and, in all honesty, can get very boring very, very quickly. It can be just a chore to get through, because even when you're playing the levels, it's not really apparent straight away how you're supposed to be able to get through each phase of each level that you're progressing through. There's certain instances where you would need to reach a higher point or a higher part of the ground, but you can't get to it normally, so what you have to do is jump and dive between certain platforms, and there's only specific ones that you can do this trick on in order to progress. So in many respects, when you're playing through the game, it won't take long for you to get bored, in all fairness to it. You'll find yourself very quickly looking for something else, which again is another shame with regards to movies. When you see games like this here, yes, it does have some decent qualities for what it tries to do, but it's not executed the way that it could have been. And the fact is, with the lack of background music, it doesn't really add any depth to it, and it really takes away from the experience in most regards. Now, it's still better to play than some of the games on this list, but it definitely isn't the best one. Back to the Future 3 would release on the Master System and a variety of other consoles in 1991 to capitalise off the success of the third and final entry of the iconic movie franchise itself. And this game, in many ways, was a drastic overhaul compared to the mess that we got with Back to the Future 2 previously. And considering that it was published by the same crowd that helped with development of the game, it definitely is a step up from its previous entry in many ways, but at the same time still would come with its own flaws and quirks that would definitely put a lot of people off, because the game, while it was decent and in many ways reflected a lot of level design features that were seen on the likes of the Sega Mega Drive or Genesis, but it was still considered as a lackluster attempt in many ways, especially when you consider it to other movie franchise games seen on these systems. But it still wouldn't stop the game from selling in high numbers on a variety of different systems. Some of the lesser powered systems of the time, with the likes of the Spectrum and the like, the game sold in high numbers on those systems, so it definitely appealed to quite a few. But when we look at it back then, not everybody had access to all of these consoles. People either had one or the other, and that was it. Some people would have a Sega console or a Nintendo console, or some people would have a home personal computer. So whichever version you had, they were the only games that you had available, so what you see is literally what you got. There was no ifs or buts about it. But truthfully, anything could have been better than the previous entry in the series, in all fairness. The game does present some decent graphics, however, when we look at it from a visual standpoint, and it does offer a variety of different modes and some quirky features that are worth exploring. But if you can overcome the game's brutal difficulty, because even the first level, let's just put it this way, it will test your patience. Make no mistake about that. So with this entry, you'd like to think that in some cases games could start to improve, but we have yet to see some other games that will destroy that enthusiasm very quickly. The Flinstones game would release on multiple systems in 1988 and would be ported to the Sega Master System in 1991. And while this game wasn't reflective of the movie, it was inspired heavily by the iconic cartoon program that we would all have been familiar with growing up, as the Flintstones was literally the forefront of everybody's TV screen during the early years. With that being said, the game was met with much criticism. While the graphics were considered to be its defining factor. Even on the Master System, the graphics are quite decent, but the slow, sluggish gameplay, and especially some of the infuriating aspects with the puzzles and the levels, and just the sluggishness of the overall controls, will definitely just leave you quickly turning the game off and going on to something else. Because if you die at any point, it's literally game over and you have to start the entirety of the game from level 1, all from scratch. Because every level pretty much is time based to some degree, bar the last level, but it's just so finicky in how it controls, with the collision detection, especially with the last level when you have to save pebbles on the construction site, when you have to use the jump mechanic. It's so bad that it's laughable, and that's just putting it nicely. The best part about this game is its graphics, unfortunately, but there's very little else. Even though the gameplay ideas of the different modes, especially with the likes of the third level where you're in the bowling alley, but the problem even with that is that the games take far too long to progress, and you can be there for ages before you can even progress to the last level. So that in itself can annoy players too. There's just so many things that this game could have done better, but definitely wasn't executed in the way that it could have been, which is a shame. Another Terminator 2 game. Hopefully this is better than the last one. In this case, only just. Terminator 2 Judgement Day, the arcade game, saw ports to multiple consoles in 1991 that would take the elements from the iconic game onto the home screens, and some of the versions of this game were considered to be very, very close to that of the arcade version, especially with the likes of the SNES or Super Nintendo, along with the Mega Drive, were considered among some of the best entries. But when we look at the lower versions with the 8-bit systems, not so much. As while it's impressive that the games are running the way that they do, the gameplay was often criticised for being very repetitive and tedious overall. And to make things worse, especially when we look at the likes of the Sega Master System version, while this is an arcade shooter, it isn't compatible with the light phaser gun that you could use with the console, which definitely left a lot of questions, because that was definitely the highlight feature of it, that you needed to use a light phaser or gun, but the fact is that you couldn't use it and only use the controller. It actually made the game a lot more difficult to play, and as a result, because you're using the controller, everything moves a lot slower, which results in more sluggish gameplay. So a few minutes into this, more than likely you'll quickly get bored. It is impressive, the fact is that it's running on the system the way that it does, and the fact is everything moves the way that it should, and it has limited but decent animations with regards to the machines that appear on screen. But honestly, there are better versions of the game available out there. Tom and Jerry the movie would originally be released on the Sega Master System in 1992 and would later get ports on the Sega Game Gear and even with the Nintendo Game Boy Color and a few other systems in 1993. But the game didn't do an awful lot to really live up to the events of the movie, which at the same time didn't also receive great reviews, which sees you playing as Tom running around a variety of different levels with the aim to catch Jerry. That's always constantly trying to hinder your progress by laying down traps. But one of the major gripes with this game is it acts as an action platformer, but Jerry can go where he likes at any time, and then Tom is usually stuck with weird platforms that just appear at random at different intervals and he can't get past them. Your only alternative is to climb up them, and you also have to contend with the screen in some of the levels moving too, as they act as kind of like a timer. So once Tom is removed from the screen or doesn't get to a certain place in time, it's considered game over and you have to try the level over again. So you have to complete a variety of different puzzles and you have to try and get to the end point while avoiding many traps. But these platforms that appear in the levels are just weird and in many cases shouldn't really even be there. The ideas behind the level design in this game is definitely questionable, to say the least. There could have been a lot more effort put into it, but as in with a lot of these games, clearly that wasn't the case, which is a shame really, as the game does have some fairly decent graphics for it, considering it being an 8-bit system. But in all honesty, I think that that's really the best part about the game. But it won't take you long to get frustrated and just find the game to be too tedious to really enjoy in many regards, because no sooner have you started a level, you're literally hit with a load of platforms that literally just stop you in your tracks and you can't go anywhere until you've climbed up them, and it just becomes more frustrating than anything else. So again, this is another one that is probably best avoided at all costs, which doesn't do justice for the franchise. As we all know, anyone that grew up with cartoons, we are all familiar with Tom and Jerry, as they're among some of the greatest cartoon characters ever in existence. So a lot of these games that were coming out around that time definitely don't do this franchise justice at all. Superman would be released in 1992 in North America and would release under the name of Superman the Man of Steel in 1993 on different systems. The game would originally be released on the Mega Drive, with later ports to the Game Gear and Sega Master System, but would receive generally mixed to negative reviews, stating that while the graphics, especially in the Mega Drive version, were considered decent, the gameplay features were limited, even with regards to the overall storyline, as the game doesn't allow for the proper use of Superman's powers and abilities, as even weaker enemies can do serious damage to him, which definitely doesn't depict the overall idea behind the character. It makes him look weak, which doesn't do him justice at all. So you have to fly through a multitude of different levels, both from like a flying and side-scrolling perspective, anywhere from rooftops to different types of environments where you have to defeat robots and other enemies that are always constantly getting in your way, where you have to stop some of the many enemies from Brainiac and other well-known villains within the Superman franchise. But again, this game is just a contribution to the many series of entries that have an iconic name attached to it, but presented a lackluster experience when it was presented in a video game format. And when we look back, it just doesn't make sense how they couldn't really figure out a way of how to make these games more presentable and even make them more playable. Many of these games, in most cases, often felt lackluster, but just mostly unfinished, as it just felt like everything was wrong with them, like between the collision detection, even the use of power. A lot of these ideals just felt unbalanced. But in many cases, a lot of these games were developed as usually a quick cash grab to capitalise on a popular trend or movie or TV series that was coming out at the time, which is a shame because there's so much elements to some of these games that could have been 10 times better than what we originally got, and this game is no different. But things would get better, as we have looked at some of the worst games in this list, and there are better games to come, that I can guarantee. Some of them are considered to be among some of the best on the system, so we will be looking at them shortly. The Jungle Book game, released on a multitude of different systems in 1994, with the Master System and Game Gear being among the long sea of titles available. While the game was based on the iconic Disney movie, the game was met with harsh criticism and reviews, but would state that probably the Sega Genesis version would be the best of the bunch with regards to its visuals and overall gameplay style. The Super Nintendo game also received mixed reviews, but still stated that it had really good graphics and good sound design. The 8-bit systems, however, wouldn't be as well favoured, as they had quite clunky gameplay aesthetics, controls. The visuals were okay, they could have been better when you consider it to other Disney games that were released on the console. When you look at the likes of the Mickey Mouse games, even the Lion King and Aladdin, they had far better graphics and visuals. The Master System and Game Gear versions just definitely suffered with its overall control systems, as the collision detection and the overall just fiddliness of the controls definitely would frustrate a lot of players. Plus, a lot of gamers often found that the soundtracks on the 8-bit systems found it to be very drony and annoying after a while. Now, I personally owned this game, and yeah, I can definitely attest to that. Now, I did finish it and I played it quite a few times in my younger years. Now, I would have had a lot more patience for games back then, but I will admit this game did definitely test me even back then. And while I did play it, I wouldn't put the same time and effort into it now. If I was to play this now today, which I did recording footage for this video, I found it to be very frustrating, and I was often questioning like, how did I even manage to spend the time playing it back then. Now, in saying that, I played a lot of games like the games are covered on this list. There's a majority of them that I did play and I actually finished them, which you might be thinking, why would you even bother? But I suppose back then I was just any excuse to play any type of game that I could get my hands on, regardless of whether it was good or bad. I was always willing to kind of give it a go and see how I got on with it, and sometimes I just wouldn't let a game defeat me. I would just keep playing it until I gradually finished it, and in many cases I would, but once I finished it, in most cases I wouldn't play them again. Now, with regards to the Jungle Book, now I played it quite a few times, and I did like certain elements of it, but there was definitely bits that were very cumbersome and frustrating. I'm not going to deny that for a second, and anyone that's played the game will definitely understand that and know that. I'm sure you would have found it equally as frustrating in all respects. Like, if you want to play any sort of decent version, play it on 16-bit systems. It definitely is a better experience in all regards. But this version, you probably are better to just leave it as it is and look for something else. There are better Disney games on the Master System, which we will definitely look at. The movie of Hook, that starred Robin Williams, was an interesting game to say the least, as there were several different styles of video games that were released based off of the movie that contributed many elements from side-scrolling action games to point-and-click adventures. The arcade version would also be seen as a side-scrolling beat-em-up that allowed you to support up to 4 players. The console versions, however, would be more of a side-scrolling platforming adventure. It would be the PC and home computer systems with the likes of the Amiga and Atari ST that would contribute to the point-and-click adventure style of these games. So the likes of the Super Nintendo, the Sega Mega Drive, Master System and Game Gear would get more platforming approaches to the concept of the game. And in many cases, the reception was kind of varied across the board, while some games were considered fairly decent, more notably with the PC entries, as they had more of a story-driven narrative to them that reflected that seen in the movie. Even the Nintendo Game Boy versions got fairly decent reviews, but the other consoles with the likes of the Master System and Game Gear were considered the weaker versions of the game overall. Now, it's not to say that they're bad games. If anything, when we look at it compared to many other movie-inspired franchise games that were seen on the console, it definitely is a lot better with regards to what it offers. So the gameplay mixes up platforming and action style elements where you use weapons and magical powers to eradicate enemies, but you also mix up different gameplay styles, from jumping on different platforms to even swimming underwater, and the goal is always to reach the end of the level where you have to collect extra lives and other additional weapons and resources to level up your character that can aid in your quest for survival. And in all fairness, the Master System version isn't a half bad looking game in all respects to it. It is decent to look at, but the gameplay elements do leave a lot of questions with regards to its overall difficulty, as this game is difficult. It does take quite a while to master the specific elements within the game itself, and will take quite a few tries to fully understand the whole complexity with regards to the control and combat systems. But once you do master it, you can get a distinct feel for how the game plays, and you can find a way to get through the majority of the levels, but there will be certain hiccups along the road, especially on later levels when you're on like cliff stages or when you're having to find your way jumping across platforms on waterfalls. Those levels will require a lot of trial and error in order to fully complete and even to win against, as they are just overly very difficult. But early on in the game, when you're not familiar, you'll find yourself even to get through the first level, because with these older games there's no real basic entry point to get you started on your journey, or like a simpler element, or it doesn't provide like a simple tutorial based level just to get you familiar with the game. You're pretty much thrown in straight away in the deep end, and let's just put it this way, you'll find that even the first level alone can be a torture to deal with at times. There's definitely an imbalance with regards to the overall difficulty of the game, especially from the early point, so that will frustrate a lot of players. But it is a decent experience the more time you do put into it. Once you can figure out all of the quirks and nuances, it definitely is better than a lot of the other movie inspired games that are out there. Not the best, mind you, but it is one that might be worth a look at for some, especially for fans of the movie. The Incredible Hulk was one of the later entries added to the lineup of Master System games that were inspired by TV shows and movies when it released in 1994. The game was released across a multitude of different systems, from the Sega Mega Drive, Master System, Game Gear and also on the Super Nintendo. The game, while on paper would look like it would prove to be a good title, was met with mixed reviews upon its release, with critics praising the visuals and music and variety of moves at its disposal, but criticised the lack of overall controls and the lack of enemy variety, stating it to be too unfamiliar and yet repetitive at the same time. And this would be across the board on all systems pretty much. But even contributing to it, the Master System version, when we look at it, and even the Game Gear version, was quite impressive, considering it was on a lesser powered 8-bit system. The graphics held up really well. If anything, it's one of the better looking games on the Master System itself. The play is quite well, it is fast paced, it does have some distinct features that contribute to its overall characteristics. With the majority of the game you will be playing as the Hulk, but you will need to transform back into your human form in order to reach and access smaller areas that Hulk can't physically access. The only downside is when you do transform back to your human form, you virtually are too weak to withstand any damage, because 1 or 2 shots and you're dead pretty much, whereas with the Hulk you can sustain a lot more damage. But that's not to say that the game is easy. Even once you go into your mutated form, platform, as you can take a lot of damage as the Hulk, and even more so in boss fights. It can be quite tricky and can be quite a long drawn out process with regards to boss fights, as it can take quite a while to defeat your opponents, and that can also add to the frustration with the overall experience. It's not the best of these type of games that's out there, but it definitely had some distinctive elements, definitely from a visual standpoint, as especially on 8-bit systems, like I said, it was definitely one of the better looking titles on those consoles. But it's still an interesting idea that is worth a look at in all regards, especially if you're fans of the comic book franchise. Predator 2, when it released in the year of 1992, tried to capitalise on the events of the movie of the same name, and in some cases the versions seen on the likes of the Sega Mega Drive and Master System were considered to be okay ports, to say the least. If anything, they were better than many of the other movie adaptations that were released for these systems at that time, that gave you full freedom of movement to move around the screen at will, where you had to fend off and fight against a variety of different enemies that would be shooting at you in return, where you're fighting against different criminal and gang members, but you also had to avoid the ever-present Predator, as he would always be lurking within the vicinity, and if he got close to you, now you wouldn't see him really as such, you'd only know he was in the area at different intervals, where a collection of dots would appear on the screen, so that would let you know that he was close by. So you would have to avoid these dots. If you got caught by them at all, it was instant game over. So you had to try and keep moving around without dying, and you also had to be aware of the fact that you had enemies shooting at you from everywhere. Like, the game had some good ideas and some good gameplay mechanics, but what was the real defining factor of this game that contributed to its overall failure was the inconsistency of the enemies. Enemies could shoot you from anywhere literally on the screen, and they could literally shoot you off the screen where you couldn't see them, but the enemies were so relentless, it was a never-ending slog trying to get through them, because the enemies were infinite. They never stopped appearing on screen, so no amount of health, power-ups or weapons could really contribute to your overall success, as you were just in constant battle, and then you had to also be aware of the Predator trying to take you out at different intervals as well. So with the game being fast paced and with a lot of action, on paper it should sound good, and in many cases it does offer up and live up to some of those ideals, but it's just too frustrating and too cumbersome for it to be enjoyable, because you find before long, because the enemies are so consistent and they never stop spawning, you will just find yourself quickly getting bored and frustrated, because it's just the same thing over and over again, and it doesn't add any new appeal or variety to the overall gameplay, which is a shame, because this is another one of those games that had a lot of promise. It had some good features and mechanics, but just isn't executed the way that it should have been. It could have been so much better. The Flash would make an appearance on the Sega Master System in 1993. The game also got a previous release on the Nintendo Game Boy in 1991, but very like the Flintstones game that we looked at, the game wasn't based off of any movie of sorts, but was based off of the actual TV show that was running at the time, that saw you taking on the role of this iconic character with the aim to take down the many villains that are causing havoc within the city, where you must traverse through many distinct environments with platform elements, puzzles and traps to avoid. The game did get decent reviews, but however, the one major gripe was due to the control system, as the game did have decent graphics, but the controls were very, very difficult to master, as it felt like you were skating on ice the whole time. The Flash could move very quickly, but you couldn't stop quickly. It just felt like every time you tried to stop, or when you jumped onto a platform, it felt like you would always slide off of it, and you would always fall into some unexpected trap. And to make things worse, coupled with the unbalance of the controls, the difficulty of the game would gradually increase as you progressed, making the game even more temperamental and frustrating for many. The game had a lot of promise, in all fairness to it really did, but it's just too many of those little niggles and frustrating elements just stopped it from being a top tier game. Dick Tracy, the video game, would see releases on different systems during the early 90s, more predominantly with 1991, mainly on the Sega Genesis and Master System. That would see you take on the character from the movie, fending off against a variety of different mobsters, where you play from a side-scrolling perspective, where you play through a variety of different level and genre types in each of the environments within the game, from side-scrolling action, where you have to walk, jump, duck, shoot enemies with your weapons, where you also have to engage in a variety of different sub-levels where you can earn bonus points that can contribute to you earning extra lives or health or upgrades that you will need to further progress. What's really unique about this game is that it does capture the comic book vibe from that scene in the movie, and it does do that quite well, but there are some differences with regards to the versions. As the game, yes, it did get released on the Master System and Mega Drive, but it did also get a release on other consoles as well, even with the likes of the Game Boy. The Mega Drive version, however, would be considered to be the best entry of all of these games, and yet the Master System is impressive for what it tries to do, as you have a variety of different elements that you have to be aware of from side scrolling, but you also have enemies at the top of the screen, so when you're shooting weapons you can literally shoot enemies across the street or in different areas of the screen, but you had to use different button combinations in order to do that. With the Mega Drive version, it was easier to incorporate all of those different combinations and moves to engage with different formats, but on the Master System, however, because of the lack of buttons, you had to use different button combinations in order to do the same effect, and it wasn't as easy to do and could be very frustrating. The game was overall a lot harder as a result, which made it more difficult to really get far in the game, which contributed to its reviews of the time. It had potential, but just the difficulty of the game definitely contributed to its overall failure, which is a shame because the game definitely had promise, but it's still better than some of the entries we've seen here on this list. James Bond 007 The Duel is an action game that was released and published by Domark on the Sega Master System in 1992. The game would also get subsequent ports on the Game Gear and even the Mega Drive or Genesis. What is interesting about this version of the game, as it isn't tied to any movies specifically within the James Bond franchise, as it had its own unique story arc to it, but also used the likeness and resemblance of Timothy Dalton's version of James Bond from the movies of the time. So essentially it was considered as his last outing as James Bond. So with the game featuring an original story, it still featured some of the iconic villains from the franchise with Jaws and Oddjob, where you have to traverse different levels and platforming sections using a variety of different weapons at your disposal, from your pistol to whatever weapons you can find, while finding health items and other resources in order to survive. But you must defeat a variety of enemies while trying to reach the end objective, and in most cases you will have to face some familiar boss fights towards the end of each level. There are a total of 5 levels in the game that take you across different areas to explore, from a ship to a Caribbean island to a jungle, even an underground power plant. So it's an interesting take on this iconic franchise. While it's not considered as the best action game of its type, it definitely is an interesting look into the story behind the James Bond character. And the Master System version, in fairness, does the game justice, because it did get decent reviews across the board, so it's definitely among some of the better of these movie inspired titles, as it gets a lot right. Now the gameplay is quite slow, but once you get into it, it's fairly decent to play through. It just will take some time to get familiar with some of the control methods and the layouts of the enemy attack patterns and so forth, but it's generally one of the better games of this type on the system for sure. The Lion King game was released on multiple platforms in 1994 and is an action platform experience that sees you taking on events from the iconic movie, where you play as a young Simba that gradually evolves into his adult form as you progress, with the goal to reclaiming your kingdom, that takes you through many environments that are distinctive from the movie. And one of the best factors and most memorable elements from the game is that the artwork was created by the original artists that worked on the movie. So if we look even at the 16-bit console games, they're among some of the greatest seen of that era of games. They're definitely beautiful, and the same can be said even with the likes of 8-bit systems. The graphics on the game are among some of the best seen during that time period, especially with regards to the visuals and animations. But make no mistake, like the 16-bit versions of this game, the Master System and Game Gear versions are just as difficult and frustrating. They are very good games, mind you, but they are insanely insanely difficult to master. I remember playing the Mega Drive version all those years ago. It was actually the first version of the game that I ever played, and I thought it was really cool. I just loved the graphics and the visual style. Definitely one of the best looking Mega Drive games I'd ever seen at the time, but even I will admit that game was ridiculous in terms of its difficulty. And the Master System version, even when to play it now years later, it's no different in terms of its difficulty. It really is frustrating and it's tough. Sometimes it can be overwhelming to fully understand what it is that you're supposed to do or where you're supposed to go at any given time, and especially on later levels where you have many of the puzzles, especially where you're on the island type levels and you have to travel and climb trees where you have the monkeys to throw you across different areas. So it's kind of like a puzzle where you have to climb on a tree, roar the monkey to get him to change his position, only to get you to be thrown to a different area so that you can keep progressing. And that can also hinder your progress, because if you don't do it the right way, it can contribute to a lot of frustration, really, because if you're not sure of what to do, it would just drive you crazy. It really will. And then with the boss fights, they can be quite unpredictable with regards to the overall combat mechanics, because it's not apparent from the get-go as to what you're supposed to do, and it will take quite a few tries to figure out the process of how to defeat each of the enemies. So that too can also add to the frustrating factor of the game. But in saying that, while it does have some inherent flaws, it definitely is one of the better movie tie-ins seen on the system, and it is worth a look for sure, regardless of which version of the game you play, whether you're playing it on 16-bit systems or 8-bit systems. It is a game that is worth looking into for sure. Mortal Kombat, one of the greatest and yet most controversial video game franchises of all time, especially during its early years, saw release on multiple systems, being ported from the legendary arcade entry that would see releases on the likes of the Sega Mega Drive, Super Nintendo and other formats, but most impressively of all would be its ports on the likes of lower powered 8-bit systems. While yes, they're definitely not as good as the more powerful entries, you can't help but deny that it's very impressive to see the games of this caliber running on these older systems. And they do play fairly decently compared to other fighting games of its type. It's definitely one of the better ones out there. In fairness to it, the game got two of its sequels also released on the Master System, with Mortal Kombat 2 and Mortal Kombat 3 in later years, which was even more impressive. But I think the first two games were definitely the best on the system, because with Mortal Kombat 3 it definitely started to change up its whole gameplay style with the addition of combos, and I think the 8-bit systems really just couldn't contribute to that aesthetic, and it struggled with some of those dynamics. Whereas especially with the first game, the movement and the combat styles were a lot more simple, with sweeps, punches and simple kicks, and they were easier to execute as well. And plus you also had the addition of the fatalities in this game as well, like that of the Mega Drive, and even the stage fatalities. So it was impressive to say the least that you could execute these features in this game. And while it might seem like it's clunky by today's standards, which it is, it was impressive for its time and did play quite well. So it definitely was quite an impressive port in my opinion, looking back, as I originally played the Mega Drive version during my first experience of the game, but one of my brother's friends from school had the Master System version sometime later, and I remember getting to play it and was quite impressed with it. Yes, it is very different from compared to its 16-bit counterpart, but still, for those back then, because not everybody had a Mega Drive, so to get to play Mortal Kombat in any format at all was definitely an interesting time. Honestly, it definitely is one of the best fighting games on the Master System, period. Jurassic Park, the game, when it released in 1993, would be added to a variety of different consoles, with the Sega Mega Drive, Master System, Game Gear to name but a few. The Mega Drive version was praised for its distinctive and detailed visuals that definitely reflected that of the movie, but the imbalance of some of the gameplay elements left for a very difficult experience. Although while the game was short, it was tough to play in many regards, and the same can be said with the ports on 8-bit systems with the Master System and the Game Gear. While they were praised for their distinctive graphical style, considering them to be definitely up there among some of the better games seen on the Master System, as they really pushed the limitations of the console, but it was criticised for its overall short length and distinctive gameplay, that in many cases there was certain imbalances with regards to some of the combat physics and difficulty of certain features. The game would be easy to a certain point, but there would be certain levels where there'd be areas that would be tricky, and and would take quite some time to get past. But overall, that would really be the only major gripes with the game. But the game would definitely offer up different elements compared to that seen on the Mega Drive or Genesis, whereas with the first level in the 8-bit version saw you playing like from a light gun perspective, where you had to defend the Jeep from different monsters, dinosaurs, and even a T-Rex that was constantly chasing you, trying to take chunks out of your vehicle. So you had to reach the end point before the vehicle was completely damaged beyond repair. So that offered a different element to the game, and it was interesting. So the remaining levels would contribute to elements seen in the Sega Mega Drive, where you had to explore different levels, use different weapons, explore and use different platforming elements in order to hunt for resources and survive enemies in order to progress. But definitely the graphical elements are its most impressive feat, and you will see it a lot more later in the game, especially on later levels. There is a really high level of detail that's associated with some of the characters and environments, so that alone is enough of a warrant to check the game out. But it's definitely not the best of these movie ports. There are better ones out there, but it's definitely one of the better ones that's seen. The Terminator is one of the most iconic movies ever created, and it was also one of the major films that put Arnold Schwarzenegger on the map, as he was the perfect fit for the role. So it would be inevitable for the film to see adaptations onto games consoles, and luckily enough the movie adaptations of this game were fairly decent across the board. When we look at the sea of other titles that came before it and after it, this was definitely one to look out for in many respects. While it was quite short in terms of its overall length, there was enough features in the game to keep you interested for some time. While the versions were quite different in many respects, like when we look at the Sega Genesis version, while it had some very decent graphics and great sound effects and visuals, the Master System and Game Gear versions would differ in distinctive ways, but also made use of the limitations of the hardware to present very unique experiences in many regards, as the game was praised for its dark and moody scenery and futuristic soundtracks, which is definitely apparent in the games. For me personally, the first game I played was the Sega Master System version of it, and even though this game was released in late 1991, 1992, a whole 8 years after the film's original release in 1984, but they were fairly decent games. Make no mistake about that. Like the Master System version, yes, it can be tough to master when you first get into it, but it will take some time to get to grips with all of the distinctive elements that are in the game. That starts off seeing you playing the first level in the future, where you have to destroy the time travel device, seeing you play as Kyle Reese from the movie that goes through the events kind of before the start of the film, leading into the events of the film, that takes you from the future into the modern day at the time, 1984, where you have to rescue Sarah Connor from the Terminator, where you will have to go through a variety of different levels, from city streets to the famous Technoir nightclub to face off against the Terminator itself, then to rescue Sarah again from the police station, to the final confrontation with the Terminator in the factory towards the end. But this game definitely reflects the vibe and moody essence of that of the movie, and it does it very, very well. The game is short. Like with the Master System, if you get a good run at it, you can have the entirety of the game finished in just little under 20 minutes, and that's on a good run. But that's not to say that it's easy, because it's not. It will take a lot of attempts and many mistakes and a lot of frustrating times in order to get there. But once you master it, it's a decent experience, and it's definitely one of the better movie tie-ins on any of the consoles seen at that time. So it's definitely one to try out.
Dracula.
Bram Stoker's Dracula, the iconic movie, would see many game ports to a variety of different systems, from 1993 all the way through to 1995, seeing releases on both console and home computers, from handheld systems to the more popular gaming systems of the time, with the likes of the Super Nintendo, Mega Drive, Sega CD, even as far as the Nintendo Game Boy, NES console, the Sega Master System, Game Gear, and even on personal computers with MS-DOS, PC and the Amiga. All versions of the game slightly differ to each other. However, the likes of the 8-bit systems with the NES and the Sega Master System and Game Gear versions were the closest rendition to each other with regards to their overall play types and style, with a mix of action and platforming elements. Visually, the games also looked very similar, but if you compare both the Master System and the NES versions, the Master System definitely looks better with regards to the overall graphics, as it had more detail with regards to the colour palette, as the NES had a limited colour palette, leading the Master System to be more bright and vibrant in its visual style. The game itself now did receive mixed reviews across the board on all of the systems it was released on, but it definitely did appeal to fans of vampire movies, as yes, it didn't fully take all of the elements seen in the iconic movie. It kind of moved away from it in terms of what it was trying to do, but definitely offered up many distinctive elements for fans of the action platforming genre, and the games themselves would be a lot better than most people would be led to believe. I personally owned Bram Stoker's Dracula on the Master System itself, as I got it in later years, and I found it to be quite a good title, if at times a bit frustrating and a little bit on the repetitive side, as you always had to find your way through levels and there was always like an end level boss that could differ in its attack patterns and had variety of different difficulty elements, but once you figured out how to deal with certain controversies around those features, you could definitely have a worthwhile experience, to say the least, but it did require a lot of time and patience because the game could be very frustrating at times. But if you liked exploring, there was definitely a lot to have in the game itself, as there was a lot of hidden areas and features and items of interest that you could find and explore, so that also contributed to the overall appeal to the game. Now, you were limited on some of the levels with regards to time, so you had to make sure that you got through as quickly as you could, but it still didn't stop you from wanting to explore to find unique weapons or items of interest, as even for me personally, that was the part of it I enjoyed the most, the exploration, trying to find all the hidden rooms, places where you would think there wouldn't be rooms, there would be rooms, or vice versa. So that's what kept you playing, and that's what added to the longevity of the experience. Not the best of these style of games, but I definitely recommend it if you're a fan of the movie, but also if you do like this style of game, as there's a lot here that contributes to it, and it takes a lot of inspiration from even the likes of earlier Castlevania games, so there's definitely a lot to be had with this experience. Star Wars is an action game that takes much of its inspiration from the events seen in the iconic movies that would be released on a multitude of different consoles, with the Master System being one of them, along with the Game Gear. That would see you playing through a variety of different styles of levels, anything from platforming and action sections to open world type environments where you're using your ship to traverse across a variety of different maps to reach different points, so that you can then go into like caves and other types of locations in order to complete objectives, fight off bosses and enemies, and collect items of interest to further progress the story. At its time, it was considered as quite an impressive idea for the game, which was heavily receptive with regards to its reviews, considering it to be one of the better movie adaptations to video games during that time. And it showed that with a bit of effort, that games of this type could shine amongst a sea of other titles that were out there, as many of them were considered to be very lackluster and just very underwhelming, to say the least. So each of the elements of the game follows specific sequences with regards to the overall storyline plot of the original movie, where you could play as Luke Skywalker and interact with a variety of other characters and iconic elements from the ever popular movie. And while the Master System version was considered decent, the Game Gear version was also well received and also provided access to a few additional exclusive levels that weren't seen on previous versions. So it gave more excuse for players to experience more elements that the game had to offer in many respects. An interesting title, and definitely one of the better movie ports seen on the system, for sure. Rocky released for the Sega Master System in 1987, and this game would combine all of the elements from the original 4 iconic movies of the franchise, where you take on the role of the iconic movie character, taking on all of the many opponents that he would have faced throughout each of the original 4 movies, where you fight Apollo Creed, Clubber Lang and Ivan Drago, with each fight consisting of a total of 15 rounds in duration, with increasing difficulty levels with regards to each opponent that you will face. You will have the ability to play in variety of different game modes with training regimes in between fights to level up your character to get you ready for the next altercation. The game would also give you access to a 2-player mode so that you can play the game with your mates. Now when we look at it in the grand scheme of things, compared to other boxing or sports games that were out at the time, the game itself didn't really offer anything new, but what the game was highly praised for was its unique visuals. As for its time, it was definitely one of the best looking games seen on the Master System console. It definitely brought the vibrancy and the iconic nature of the movies to life on the video game screen, with all of the unique colours and assets and environments that Rocky fought in that definitely appealed to that nature. So it definitely reflected the qualities of the movie and did it quite well. It's an interesting title, it's fun to play. Yes, it is difficult, but it is a good blast to play with your mates, and even the single player experience will provide enough challenge for you to really take things to the next level. It's definitely one of the better movie tie-ins seen on the console for sure, and it's definitely one that I highly recommend you check out. The Ghostbusters video game released across a multitude of different consoles not long after the film's release, but would get later ports onto a variety of home console systems quite a few years later. The game predominantly was set to be favoured on the Commodore 64 amongst a sea of other home computers of the time, and these games would gradually be ported over to later systems that tried to capitalise on the popularity of the iconic movie, which for me personally is my favourite movie of all time. So getting to play the Sega Master System version of the game was a highlight in all respects, and I quite enjoyed it for what it offered. Mind you, it was tricky and it is very different to a lot of other games that were released on later systems. Like if you compare the Master System version to the Sega Mega Drive version, it's a completely different game. The Mega Drive version is more of an action platformer, whereas the Master System and even other versions of the game that came before it on the likes of the NES, even on the PC, the Atari 2600, even with the Commodore 64, it acted more as like a strategy game that had open world type of elements that allowed you to move around the map, to slow down the ghosts, to stop them from completely destroying the entirety of the city, all while you were trying to capture ghosts to build up enough money so that you could get to the end of the game. And then when you did get to the end of it, there were some subtle differences regarding of the versions that you got, but you also had to try to get past the Stay Puft Marshmallow Man from squishing you to death to get into the hotel, or to get into the apartment block to get to the top so that you could fight off in the last and final confrontation against Gozer. So there was a lot of elements in the game that added many different gameplay styles, which was unique in its own right. Although while considered as quite short, there was a lot of strategy involved, but there was definitely a lot of fun elements as well, especially with the car scenes where the game would transition into you driving the Ecto-1 and you had to speed to a certain area or location so that you could try and get involved in encounters with the many different ghosts that were haunting various buildings throughout the city. So if you managed to capture them, you would get money which you could then put into better equipment so that you could keep leveling up until you could get to the end of the game. So it was pretty cool, but if at any point you lost all your money or if the city got completely damaged, it would be game over. But that being said, later on in the game it also got equally more difficult if you lost all of your characters on the apartment scene when you're trying to get to the top of the tower and defeating all of the ghosts along the way. And then equally as such, if you face off against Gozer at the end, it can be quite tricky to figure out his attack patterns, and a lot of it will come down to trial and error in order to defeat him. I found that many times over the years playing the game. It was very frustrating, but at the same time enjoyable. And one of the interesting facts with it as well that definitely helped was the fact that you could enter in specific cheat codes that would give you additional resources and money, so that could make the game a little bit easier for you, so you wouldn't have to worry about getting to the end as such. A tricky game to master, and while it didn't receive the best in terms of reviews, it sold very well across the board on all systems that it was released on. But then considering it was also part of one of the biggest movie franchises ever to exist, it was only natural that the game would sell in high numbers. And it is a fairly decent port that tries to offer a variety of different gameplay styles into the mix. While not everybody may have enjoyed it, some like myself definitely did, but it definitely appeals to a different dynamic of player. But if you're a fan of Ghostbusters and you want to try something a little bit different, there's no harm in trying out these earlier versions of the game, the Master System one for me being one of the best of those original titles. Michael Jackson's Moonwalker, released on computer systems and even in the arcade, would try to capitalise on the success of the iconic movie. Now, the arcade version was very different compared to the console versions, with the Mega Drive and Master System being very similar in their approach, acting more so as a side-scrolling style beat-em-up, where you had to explore a variety of different levels searching for kidnapped children. So you had to utilise a variety of different combat moves and kicks and punches at your disposal, while using a variety of specific and special dance moves that allowed you to eliminate all of the enemies on screen at once. And what was cool about this feature was that when you played these elements, especially on the Master System version, it played out a segment from some of Michael Jackson's iconic music tracks with their own distinctive animations that contributed to the whole experience. So it was definitely a highlight reel in that respect. The Mega Drive version was impressive with some great visuals and sound effects, and especially with the music, but the Master System version is equally as impressive, as it in its own right helped to push the console to its limits, and it has some of the best sound and movie quality effects for a Master System game that you could possibly see for its time. Definitely the music is its highlight reel, make no mistake about that. I personally owned the game growing up. I got it for Christmas one year and I couldn't believe how good it was. Yes, it's tough and it's frustrating. If I would say one thing, the major gripe that I had with the game, it takes a while to get used to the various specifics with regards to the level layouts and design, trying to find where kids are to save them, but the most frustrating part of the game is definitely the final encounter with the last boss, as you transform into one of the mech versions of Michael's transformations that you would see in the film, where you play as a ship and you have to shoot lasers at distinctive elements that would appear on screen, and it's so over the top and so frustrating that will drive you absolutely crazy. I kid you not, when enemies shoot lasers at you, they can hit you from anywhere and they actually home in on you, so they track you. So no matter where you move on the screen, they can still hit you, and it takes a lot of faffing around and last minute moves to avoid them, but even at that, there's no guarantees that you will avoid them. There's a lot of trial and error involved in this last segment of the game, and that's the most frustrating element of it. If anything, that's what stops it from being a really fantastic game. It's just that last section, because the rest of the game, for me personally, I really enjoyed. It's just that last encounter with the final boss is definitely its Achilles heel, for sure. But regardless of that, it's definitely one of the better movie tie-ins on the Sega Master System that I definitely recommend you check out, even just to listen to the music tracks alone with the special moves, as it's definitely its highlight feature, and the music is very distinctive of that of the legendary classics that we all grew up and listened to, and considering it's played using 8-bit tunes, it's actually very good. So it's definitely one that I would consider to try out 100%. Rambo First Blood Part 2 originally started off life on the Master System in Japan in 1986 under the game Ashura, which was a completely different style of game that had a variety of different characters that you could play as. But when the game was added to the North American audience, it was rebranded under the Rambo license that allowed you to play as the iconic movie character. The game would also be released in Europe, but would also go under the name of Secret Command, which would remove the Rambo license entirely, so only the North American release had the Rambo license tied to it. And what was different about this game compared to other movie ports was the fact that you could play 2-player, and it played from a top-down perspective, so it was an action kind of shooter, and in many cases for its time is often considered as one of the best movie ports ever on consoles, as you could play co-op with your mates, so it added to the experience, where you could fight against a variety of different enemies that would attack you, and you also had to fight off against tanks, helicopters, and you had to avoid explosions, bullets, and pretty much anything that got in your way. Now the game was tough, make no mistake about that. It was challenging, but the more you put into it, the more you got out of it. It was a very intensive but very rewarding experience, and is considered by many to be one of the best games on the Master System, and definitely one of the best movie ports that ideally you should try out, regardless of which version you play. Now in hindsight, some of the versions will slightly differ in terms of its gameplay mechanics, especially with the Japanese version, because it's a very different game in its own right. While it does have the over-the-top play perspective, some of the elements and gameplay mechanics do differ slightly compared to the version of Rambo that was seen in North America. But it is definitely one of the best 2-player and co-op experiences that you can have on the Master System, without a doubt. So it's highly recommended that you try it out. A definite worthwhile experience. Rambo 3 would be another port of the iconic movie franchise that would be released on multiple different gaming systems in the late 80s, mainly with earlier 8-bit systems and even with the Sega Master System in 1989, and would be a port of the arcade title of the same name. There would be a version added to the Sega Mega Drive in 1989 that consisted of 6 levels with different types of objectives that you must complete in order to finish off each mission. With the variety of different versions of the games that were out there, the home computer versions with the likes of the ZX Spectrum, the Atari ST, Amiga, Commodore 64 and Amstrad CPC versions have less missions in them but differ drastically compared to the console versions. If we look at the Master System version, however, the game is quite impressive. It does support the light gun or light phaser accessory, which is definitely a must for this game, as it is very very tough if you're playing it with a controller. But it's definitely considered to be one of the best light gun games on the console itself, and if anything, one of the best movie tie-ins seen on the console, which has some very impressive graphics. Considering this was on an 8-bit console, the graphics are definitely a lot better than most games that you would have seen out there during this time. Considering this was released in the late 80s, it definitely pushed the power of the console to its limits. But that's not to say that it's an easy game. This is one very very tough game, but at the same time will be much easier if you had access to the light phaser controller, which is definitely a must for the best overall experience. Aladdin, when it released on gaming systems in 1994, took heavy inspiration from the ever popular movie that was released in and around that time, but would see a variety of different gameplay styles depending on the different systems that it was released on. The Sega Master System and Game Gear platforms seen the game as a side-scrolling platform and adventure game, but that would differ slightly with 16-bit consoles that saw it as more of an action platformer, as there was a lot more weapons-based combat and more challenging gameplay overall in terms of puzzle solving and that to progress. But if we look at the visuals, especially on the 16-bit systems, they're among some of the best ever seen on the Sega Mega Drive or even on the Super Nintendo. They're visually stunning and they still hold up very very well even today. But that doesn't take away from the 8-bit systems. If anything, the game's got very good reviews across the board, and one of the main compliments was the gorgeous graphics and backgrounds across all of the systems, even the 8-bit systems. Even this version of Aladdin on the Master System, while the gameplay is a little bit more simplistic to that of a 16-bit systems, as you're spending more time more so running and just jumping over platforms and avoiding obstacles while looking for items, it's still one of the better looking games on the console itself, and it's definitely one of the better looking Disney games. If anything, when we look at movie inspired games and even also Disney games, there is also a mixed factor with regards to the overall quality, but I think Aladdin, in my own opinion, is definitely the best movie inspired game that was released by Disney on the system, with regards to its gameplay style, its features and the overall elements that just make it different and unique to everything else that was out there. It is definitely one of the best of the movie inspired games, that's for sure. That's to say, if you wanted something different from the likes of the 16-bit entries, this here will definitely be a good alternative. While there's not as many action elements in the game, but it does provide a very different and worthwhile experience, so it's definitely recommended that you try it out. Alien 3 is a run and gun action adventure game that is a port of the iconic movie of the same name that was released on consoles and home computers in 1992, that took a lot of elements from the film and brought it to the gaming screen, and did a very good transition in that regard, as it was one of the best of its kind in terms of movie inspired games to ever be released during that time. As when we look back over the history of movie ports of games, when you look at the likes of games we've previously covered in this video with Home Alone, The Addams Family, Terminator 2, Judgement Day, some of the most iconic movies ever, but yet they failed to deliver with their game ports. But that wasn't the case with the Alien 3 game, as pretty much in every format that it was released on, yes, they were very different in what they offered, but they all presented very distinctive and worthwhile yet challenging experiences that were definitely worth trying. Now, the 16-bit consoles with the likes of the SNES and the Mega Drive were definitely the definitive versions of the games, as they had the best graphics, great soundtracks, and they just were very very good titles. The 8-bit versions of the games were equally as good in most regards, but But if we compare the differences between both the Master System and the NES version, yes, the NES version is decent for what it does represent, but the Master System version is definitely better in terms of its overall sound design, colour graphics, and just overall visual display, and its overall gameplay aesthetic. It is a better all-round game. But regardless of which version you had access to the game on, you would have had a good experience regardless. And it, like I said, it definitely is without a doubt one of the best movie adaptations that you could see on systems during that time. And the Master System is no different. Great graphics, it had a great soundtrack, and definitely one of the best games of its kind. If anything, it is right up there with among some of the best games on the system, in fairness to it. And it also gave access to a 2-player mode, so you could play it with your mates, taking like turns to complete levels and so forth. So there was a lot to be had here. Now the game is challenging, don't get me wrong about that, where you are very restricted with regards to ammo, resources, and more specifically time, because every level consists of you trying to find and rescue survivors, and you have to do it within a very confined set of levels, all within a very restrictive time limit. So in many cases it will take multiple tries to get familiar to your surroundings so that you can tell where all prisoners are, so that you have any chance of finding the best route possible to get through the level in the quickest possible time. Because if at any point you run out of time, it's instant game over and you'll have to start the level again. Now I owned the Master System version back years ago as a kid, and I have to say I thought it to be a very, very worthwhile experience, and for me personally it was one of my favourite games that I ever played on the console. There was just so much about it that contributed to the longevity of it. I'd find myself always going back to play it time and again because it was always challenging. There was always something different about it to explore, areas to discover, what you might not get access to in the first playthrough you were definitely trying to find out more about in later playthroughs. So if you liked exploration, the game definitely had you covered in that respect. Definitely one of the best movie adaptations of any game on the Master System or on any console, and just one of the best overall games in my opinion on the Master System itself. That is worth a try. I highly recommend it. When Batman Returns released on consoles around 1992 and 1993 that tried to capitalise on the iconic movie, we would be met with a variety of different gameplay styles depending on the platform that you would play the game on. If you were playing the game on the likes of the Sega CD, the game would act as a vehicular combat game, but if you played it on the likes of the Amiga or the PC, it would be either a beat 'em up or action adventure game. The same can be said for the likes of the Super Nintendo, which would act as an all-out beat 'em up, which would be in the same vein of the likes of Final Fight and Streets of Rage. But then on the Mega Drive it was totally different. It did have some beat 'em up elements, but acted as more of an action platformer. And the same can be said on 8-bit systems with the Game Gear and Sega Master System that also had action platforming elements, but differed in many ways to that seen on the Sega Mega Drive or Genesis. Whereas on the Mega Drive, Batman had full use to his arsenal of weapons and even the grappling hook, and you could throw batarangs and even different types of special abilities to defeat enemies and take damage out of more tougher opponents. On the Master System and Game Gear it was a different experience, as Batman had like a batarang or like a boomerang that you could throw at enemies, but instead of having a health bar you would be met with instant death upon hits. If an enemy hit you at any point you would instantly lose a life, but you could gain a variety of different power-ups that could lengthen the reach of your grappling hook and even the batarang itself of how far it could go in order to reach enemies from further afield. But you still have all of the quirky elements that would have been seen in original games, where you could use your cape in order to glide to different points at the level, which was really cool. One of the distinct features, more predominantly on the Master System version, is that you had access to a selection of different level varieties depending on the level that you were on. There was different routes that you could take, and each route would contribute to a different difficulty level. If you went through the first route, you had an easier approach to the level. Now, not to say that the game was easy, the game was really, really tough, but if you went through the second route, it would be a lot more challenging, a lot more difficult, and you had a lot more jumps and things that you had to grapple onto. Plus, if at any point, like with any platform game, if you fell out of the screen, instant death. With Batman Returns it was no different. You would instantly lose a life and you'd be respawned on the screen. But just the second route on any of the levels was always a lot more difficult than the first route. But it was a good entry point and it offered a lot of replay value to the game. So if you were playing on your first playthrough, you would ideally pick the first route on every level, which was 5 in total, that had a few different areas to explore. And then when you got more comfortable with the game and you wanted more of a challenge on your next playthrough, then you would play through all of the second routes that you could take, which again would definitely provide more of a challenge. So it was definitely a really cool aspect to it. And in many ways, the Master System in a lot of regards, even though it's more simplistic in how it approaches itself, it was often considered as one of the better versions of the release or port of this game for gaming systems, which is quite weird when you think about it. You would expect the more powerful systems to have better adaptations to the game. Now don't get me wrong, I played this game both on the Master System and on the Sega Mega Drive, and I absolutely love the Sega Mega Drive version, even though there's a lot of debates around the difficulty, which that is a seriously difficult game, I'm not going to deny that. But the one thing I loved about that game was the graphics. It had some of the best graphics ever seen on a Mega Drive game, plus for me it's got one of the best soundtracks as well. The soundtrack for that game is phenomenal, very memorable and iconic. But at the same time, a lot can be said for the Master System version. It offers a lot of challenging gameplay. If anything, it's one of the best action platformer games on the Master System, hands down, and it's definitely one of the best movie adaptations to any sort of movie game that's seen on the console itself. And like, while we've covered a lot of games that vary and differ in quality across the board, from absolutely terrible to okay and in between, but then we have some of the better games with the likes of this one here, and there's Alien 3 and a few others. But Batman Returns, in all honesty, is definitely, it could actually be possibly the best movie adapted game on the system, in fairness to it, because there's a lot of contributing factors, there's a lot of replay value, and it does have some very nice graphics for its time, and it definitely captures the essence of the Batman aesthetic really well. And it is just a lot of fun to play. While challenging, it is a lot of fun. So I definitely recommend that you try out this game if you haven't done so already. Each of the movie inspired games we've looked at on this list definitely have different and defining factors that contribute to both their success and their failures. While some games are questionable, we have seen games that definitely in many cases should never have been released in the first place, as they are very low quality, and you can't deny that. But then we have games on the other end of the spectrum that definitely warrant and are well represented due to their movie inspired counterparts that are well worth a try. Among some of the best games that we've seen here that definitely contribute to that play style would be Batman Returns, Alien 3, Moonwalker, Aladdin, Rambo First Blood Part 2, even Rambo 3, Rocky. The Terminator is also worth a look as well, Ghostbusters, and even Bram Stokers' Dracula. And there are a few other games in there that would be worth looking at, but as for the rest of them, well, there's little to be said about them in all respects. Now, generally I don't like to completely hate on games, I really don't. A lot of these games I spent a lot of time playing growing up, and I genuinely always like to give games the benefit of the doubt. But now as I've gotten a little bit older and you see things from a different perspective, you definitely see the flaws that you weren't willing to see back then. And in all honesty, they could have been so much better. But as in with many of these games back in those times, the games were developed in very short time frames because they wanted to capitalise on the popular trend and success of movies of the time, and they wanted to get a game out before the film's trend started to die off, which usually always resulted in a very lacklustre experience because they tried to just piece something together very quickly and it just felt rushed in many regards. And even the ideas behind some of the gameplay mechanics were always questionable. And once we've seen it, we can't unsee it, unfortunately. But even aside from all the bad ones, there are a few hidden gems and there are some high quality games in there that are worth definitely checking out. So it's not all bad. Which begs the question, what other games based off of iconic series or platforms are out there? Not just on the Sega Master System, but whatever other Sega console or any other gaming system out there. There's definitely a lot of them that have yet to be explored, which we will definitely look at in this next video, where we will dive behind the scenes of many more of these interesting titles to see how they fare with regards to the overall inspiration.